science enthusiasts. Welcome to SciChat. My name is Jason Zakowski. I'm the dog dad of Bunsen and Beaker, the science dogs. And the cat dad of Ginger? I'm not sure. The jury's out on that. My co-host is...
Chris Zakowski, and I am the dog mom of Bunsen and Beaker. Also the cat mom of Ginger and co-host extraordinaire.
You are the co-hostess with the mostest. We are multicasting today. We are live on Twitter Spaces. We are live on Facebook Live. Is that live squared? We are on Clubhouse and we are on Wisdom. Then this is also being recorded. Our special guest today is medical science communicator, Dr. Neuro. Dr. Neuro, how are you doing tonight?
Doing peachy. How are you guys doing?
I'm great. Just real quick, thank you for being a guest. We mentioned that at the top, but thanks for saying yes to being a guest on Science Chat.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, your Dr. Nero is a bit of a pseudonym, so we can't get into tons of specifics. But could you tell everybody whereabouts you are in the world? Like, is that too cloak and dagger?
No, I could definitely do very much in the general area, but I am right now in the Midwest United States right now. Formerly was in the East Coast for a good chunk of my life. Was a DC kid, so pretty much I'm very familiar with that, and was in New York City for quite some time as well. So any of those places I pretty much hailed from.
Now, are you like Britta from Community? Like once you live in New York City, it becomes your entire personality?
No, definitely not. I definitely, I love New York City, but it's one of those places where I'm so glad I am not living there anymore, especially with the prices there.
Oh, okay. Chris and I have visited New York, and it is a whole experience. Like it's a very cool city. I can see why people fall in love with it.
Yes, very much so.
So Doc, I introduced you as a medical science communicator. And for those of people who are just tuning into our space for the first time, on SciChat, we have these amazing guests like Dr. Neuro. We do a little mini interview and then we open up the floor to questions from the community. So the interview is just to get you to know them a little bit better so you know where their expertise lies. So I introduced you as a medical science communicator. What's your training in science, Doc?
So I have a PhD in MD, but I focus primarily on infectious diseases and epidemiology. Mm-hmm. I primarily focus really on emerging infectious diseases, or just in general pandemic preparedness response right now, and a lot of the work I do. But that's kind of where a lot of my heart comes into place for a lot of that.
So like the last 2 years, you haven't been busy, I'd imagine.
No, never.
What got you into science? Like to become a medical doctor, were you interested in health when you were young?
What it was a wonderful AP psychology teacher I had in high school.
Oh,
he was he did the whole lecture on action potentials and neurons. And he did it in such a beautiful way that it really stuck with me. And I just nerded out with him every single day. And he was like, you really should consider this path. And, my parents were excited. They were just like, yes, another doctor.
Are your parents doctors too?
No, we have relatives that are
okay. I gotcha. Well, we have mostly teachers in my family, and that's you kind of that. I actually when I was younger, I didn't want to become a teacher, but I guess it's just in my DNA.
But you know what? Teachers are the backbone of society. So we need you, and we appreciate you so very much.
Oh, thanks. That's funny. I've talked to so many scientists about what got them into science, and it's 50% of the time it's some teacher. Like it's a teacher that they really connected with. I know today I was trying to teach my chemistry 30 kids about collision reaction theory and why reactions occur. And it's because the molecules actually have to collide. So I got ball pit balls and I had them form two different teams and they had to huck the balls at each other to show the movement of molecules from reactant to products. I don't know if they learned anything, but it sure was fun.
They'll remember it though.
Yeah.
And that's what matters, you know. If anything, there's going to like be like collision theory and ball pit.
Yeah, some getting beamed by a ball pit ball. That's great. So, okay, so I kind of made light of the fact that we are still in a pandemic. We came out of a pandemic, and this is your jam. Like, this is what you study. This is what you communicate. What have you been working on or working with during the pandemic? Like, what have you been focusing on as a scientist and a science communicator?
So, you know, like a lot of my work off work, I say, like, you know, when I'm not at that is a science communicator. But when I'm at work, you know, it's primarily where my intersectional work really comes into play is mapping the clinical sciences to the data to actionable policies. One of the many challenges when you work with an organization such as like the Center for Disease Control or just any federal government is, you know, being able to figure out, okay, well, based on what we're seeing in, you know, the clinical data or in clinical trials or what we're seeing in hospitals, how can we make this into something that is impactful as a policy, right? And one of my biggest, passion really is finding equitable and accessible, policies for everyone, and really championing that in terms of like looking at stuff like such as pandemic response and things like that. So, we have a lot of great policymakers. We have a lot of great scientists, but there's not many who sit in the middle who really do that, right?
Right.
And so a lot of the work that, I focus really on is really kind of bridging that gap between it and saying like, okay, well, scientists A and B, like, what are your findings here? What is the significance of it? And then what I can do is, push this into a policy paper to make it into either some congressional liaison's desk to say, hey, these are the policies we should be considering for long COVID, or these are the policies we should be considering for, this type of disease from another country. Like, what should we be doing, and looking from a long-term perspective. So,
So your switch to the science communication, has that happened recently? Like, is that, I have a feeling it was rather forced upon you by the pandemic.
It was actually, it was very like, it was a huge coincidence how like when I switched over to medical science communication was just about when the pandemic really started. And it was really, what spurred me on really was, and we'll probably get into this a little bit. So I used to do a lot of like live streaming on Twitch, which we'll get into a little bit as well, where I streamed a lot of video games. And I started noticing that there were a lot of people coming in and just randomly asking, once they figured out my background, like random questions and talking about these old wives' tale.
Oh, that's
like
so
something
cool.
But it's like something simple as like, oh, if you, take a shower, you're going to catch a cold, something as simple as that. Then I'll just have to sit there and be like, well, that's not necessarily true, blah, blah, blah. And, but that's kind of where it really stirred me into. And then obviously the pandemic really kicked off, and I started seeing and this was inevitable, but we started seeing a lot of misinformation, disinformation regarding it.
Tell me about it.
So that's kind of where it really kind of like completely did 180 for me. And I said, okay, I need to be focusing my platform and my presence in a space that is not very heavy in the sciences. Twitch is very much a video game, live streaming platform. And I've created my own little kind of corner where I provide like a live interactive Q&A session for people to come in and ask me questions. And, we lecture and we watch documentaries, and we talk about things that, it's not covered in the media, like the Ebola crisis in Uganda currently. These are things that we cover because I feel like a lot of these, crises that we see right now in the world are not really well discussed. And there should be more discussions because it's less of a shock when things such as polio hitting New York County,
City. Isn't that something? Hey? Ugh.
Yeah. And, but like there's a lot of different things we continue, saying as, misinformation, and, and it's misinformation very much. So it's like, there's no bad intent in it. It's just simply like, this is something you've heard over and over again. So you think it's the truth, and people end up continue spreading it. And, I always have to be like, no, there's a lot more details behind it. Like, I think I did a whole debunking thing on how polio is not technically eradicated. We've eradicated 2 serotypes of it technically, but we still have one that's still very much, came out this year in Malawi, and and we still have like very much vaccine-derived, polio that's still around. So there's a lot of different things that caveat that we don't really discuss in nuances that's missed when there's no one really kind of championing that type of discussion.
It is such a hard job, Doc, being that science communicator during the pandemic. Like, our account is a science communication account. And during the height of the pandemic, we were helping our SciComm friends out by getting the message out. And the blowback was incredible. And it was kind of ugly and disgusting. So to do that work, I thank you. It's not easy, especially with the misinformation that, it's not anybody's fault. You're right. Like, people hear it from people they trust. And then that's that kind of like is what becomes their worldview. We did this big science thread, and we had a scientist on talking about dog breeds. They did this massive study, and they found that like something like 9% of a dog breed's characteristics are related to the dog breed itself. The vast majority of what makes a dog has nothing to do with their dog breed. And we got a lot of pushback from that, just this, they're like, no, and it's hard for us because we look at Bunsen, he's a Bernese Mountain Dog, and we look at Beaker, she's a Golden Retriever, and we want them to have the characteristics of their breed. Sure. Bunsen is a stoic protector and he's majestic. But that could be anybody's dog, even a Chihuahua. There's nothing,
right.
So that's the misinformation was based on, somebody's findings earlier, and it's been debunked later, and that just hasn't got out. So I hear you there. So before we get to some of the clinical trial stuff I was going to ask you about, can we talk a little bit about Twitch? What video games did you stream there? I like to play video games.
I used to be a huge, massive multi-online player. Like, was it Final Fantasy 14?
Okay.
I did. You're reaching into.
Did you do like League of Legends or something like that? Because there's kids. Okay. There's kids at my school that play that game. Okay, all right.
Yeah, I don't think I'm as like cool and hip as the kids these days with the games, but I mean, I definitely play some of the older school RPGs and things like that.
Oh, cool.
But I very much am. I feel like these days, like, there's a lot less games that I'm as interested as I used to be. But I think the most recent one I played was not on stream, but personally was a Stray, where you play
the cat game. Oh, I want to play that game so bad. It looks so adorable. Is it as adorable to play as it looks?
It is very adorable. They definitely got every single. If you're a cat lover, you're definitely going to watch it and squeal a lot. But fair warning, it is a very like I said, heart-wrenching game. So if you're very sensitive to that, be very cautious approach that game.
Oh no. Oh, I don't want the cats to get hurt. We have a cat now, and she's wormed her way into my heart. So I see why. I understand now why people are infatuated with cats, because it's like having a little fluffy ninja in your house.
I have 2 of them in my home, and they are. They pretty much own this house.
Yeah, Ginger definitely is Bunsen's boss, I'll tell you that. I think if I was to stream a game, I would stream, what do you think, Chris? Stardew Valley? Just like, hey, let's check in with Jason playing his farm game. He's going to go milk some cows and plant some turnips. Like, that's my game that I used to play lots to distress. Have you heard of Stardew Valley?
Yeah, I played a few games of that, so It's definitely a very relaxing game.
Yeah. So now on Twitch, just one more question about Twitch.
Sure.
You live stream yourself talking about various even things that come up in science, misinformation, debunking. Is that the gist of it? Okay, cool.
Yeah, and I think the most recent one I was very happy about was I live streamed the CDC's ACIP meeting, which is they're governing the decision body that reviews the data for the vaccines. And I live streamed a whole 8 hours, which was very exhausting. but it was good because it gave people who don't normally watch this, but like a live view of what, typically goes into decision making for these vaccines and how much scrutiny goes behind it.
Gotcha.
So it was a very enlightening stream. A lot of people came in, I saw a lot of comments saying like, oh my God, I didn't realize that, it wasn't an echo chamber, that people actually voice their dissent and have, like discussions and stuff. And there's a lot of data that gets put into those meetings, and it's just chart after chart after chart. But I'd sit there and provide live commentary and explain to people like why this is such a significant data point, why this slide is really cool. And, like basically kind of providing that context for people who don't normally watch this stuff and saying like, well, this is the reason why, like, when Pfizer presented this data, this is cool. And this is like reason why we should be paying attention to this, and people kind of learn from that. So
yeah, you know what, that is very interesting. We don't have like, I'm a Canadian, right? My wife and I were in Canada. So, we do pay attention to what the Americans do with the CDC because it sometimes influences Health Canada.
Yes.
So I don't know if Health Canada streams things live. I'll have to check into that. But
that'd be cool. Yeah.
Yeah. I do have some Health Canada contacts, so I'll maybe DM them. So I do have a couple questions about things like clinical trials and vaccines and misinformation. The first one I think is a very general question. For people who are in the space that don't have very much science training or medical training, what is a clinical trial? Just like could you explain that? That would maybe give us some context for what's to follow.
Absolutely. I mean, like usually for most clinical trials, what they're doing is evaluating two primary things, which is safety and efficacy of whatever pharmaceutical intervention that they intend to do for the most part.
Okay.
And so, by recruiting people or looking at certain animal models, they can actually determine whether does, drug XYZ, given like a really well done study with, complete randomized trial with people, like that's sufficient sample size, like, does it provide enough data to demonstrate the fact that A, it's safe, because we don't want to, deliver a drug that's not safe to people. Two, does it actually do what it's supposed to do, right? And and this has been very much like a cornerstone of a lot of, what we've been seeing these past several years of kind of the vaccine stuff we're doing. But, the other kind of, other side of the coin, I usually kind of talk to people about is, what we've seen recently is the Alzheimer's drugs that we've seen come out recently. And it's just one of those things where it can either demonstrate some safety and efficacy, but sometimes it can provide like, an indication for like follow-on studies or whatever it might be. But overall, the primary purpose of these clinical trials is either to, find additional study, or find new venues to do additional studies or expand it, or you submit it for review and approval for distribution, within any sort of the country you're in, and for that. So what we've been seeing right now, like with these past few years, is like a lot more scrutiny, a lot more eyeballs on kind of like our whole process, and it's a very messy process.
Yeah, that has been thrust to the forefront for our family too. Just some background like on polio. My grandmother, Marion, she contracted polio the year the vaccine came out. So I only knew her in a wheelchair. She became paralyzed from the waist down due to polio, and then had post-polio syndrome as well. So our whole family was like, okay, like vaccines are like critical for your safety and health. And then we didn't, I was kind of insulated from people who were against vaccines or questioning vaccines because that wasn't our worldview. And until the pandemic happened, I was wondering, like, since you have like a lot of knowledge around these clinical trials, maybe for people that do have questions in the space, the vaccines for COVID, for example, were they put through the same kind of like hoops and same kind of like, whatever, like safety protocols that other vaccines have?
Absolutely. The same protocols, the same standards. We did not skip any steps. It's a common misconception from folks that Operation Warp Speed, which there's another name I'm not a very big fan of, but what the COVID vaccines demonstrated was like, what if we took every single resource that we had, pump as much money as possible to reduce risk, and literally throw every single humanly body possible to develop a solution. And that's what happened with the COVID vaccines, was that we did this, and we have mountains and mountains of data to look to sift through, where folks who we had thousands of folks who enrolled in these trials worldwide. And one of the things I mentioned to people, the reason why this was such an easy clinical trial to recruit, which, by the way, if anyone who's in there kind of ever done a clinical trial, recruiting is one of the hardest parts.
Take this experimental drug.
But the idea behind it is just it's also from the prevalence factor, right? I go back to the Alzheimer's thing. Not everyone is going to have Alzheimer's or have the precursors or signs for the genetic factors for Alzheimer's. So that prevalence factor makes it much harder to recruit people. But when COVID first hit, you could literally throw a dart on any part of the globe and you can easily find a sample that's large enough to recruit people for these clinical trials. And that significantly reduced so much time, because we could easily recruit everyone and get people who were either naive to COVID or who had COVID, and truly do a large scale clinical trial, which we did. And we fast tracked it in the sense that we literally pulled every single resources to really kind of streamline a lot of the approval process. But streamlining does not mean that, again, we are not stringent on it. And even after it was approved for emergency use authorization, we still kept a program called pharmacovigilance much afterwards. And we monitored those vaccines long after people have been administered. I still get texts from the CDC's text program, which says hey, you received your vaccine 3 months ago. How do you feel?
Okay.
And you would just do a quick survey, and I encourage everyone to do it, really. But it's one of the many reasons why, one of the examples I tell people that we are actually very serious about monitoring that, and I just talked about this the other day on Twitter, was the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. When it was first approved, we started noticing a little bit higher rate than normal of those really mysterious blood clots. And, what was interesting about those blood clots was the fact that it's not usually would treat blood clots with a thing called heparin. But this was a special type of blood clot that actually would be worse if you treat it with heparin, because of this type of blood clot that's induced by this, supposedly linked to this vaccine. And we put a stop to Johnson & Johnson's vaccine immediately. We said, hey, something's not right. We need you to go back and we need you to do more studies on this. We need you to find more data before we decide to release it back to the public. And we took about a week or two to, do this. Even during the height of the pandemic, when people really need this vaccine, we were serious about, making sure that safety was a thing that we were monitoring. And this is the many reasons. This is a main example. I tell people that, the safety evaluation doesn't stop after the clinical trial. It continues way after the deployment of the vaccine. So
I think that was similar in Canada to the AstraZeneca. I don't think we got I think there was a little, they brought Johnson & Johnson in the last 4 months in Canada. I don't know.
They're both the same technologies.
Right.
They're both, the adenovirus.
Adenovirus. Yeah. That's cool though. All of that. I was kind of hoping Johnson & Johnson would come up because my first shot was AstraZeneca.
Sure.
Yeah. And then I got Pfizer, and then my booster was Moderna. So I just needed one more, and I would have collected all of the vaccines and then have
just the Infinity Stones,
the Infinity Stones, right? I would have infinite power to rule the wilds of Canada with my 4 vaccine shots. But alas and alack. Chris, you got all of the same, didn't you? All Pfizer?
Yeah, all Pfizer.
Yeah. Which she sometimes gloats over me about. So
I got all Pfizer, and my recent bivalent one I got was Moderna. So
Yeah, we gotta sign up for the bivalent one. I think in Canada you can go get your flu shot at the same time as the bivalent booster. So,
yep, co-administration is approved for both, so you can get them both at the same time.
Okay, so if you're just joining us, we have a medical science communicator, Dr. Neuro. My name is Jason. My co-host is Chris. She's working behind the scenes, putting some stuff up in the nest. I have a couple more questions for our guests, and then I think we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience. So my first one is, what are some of the zombie myths around vaccines and maybe COVID-19? Like, no matter what you do, you can't kill them. They just keep coming back.
I think the one that always still sticks around is, this idea that the vaccines will inevitably cause some sort of cancer, or that they change. It's a genetic change, right? Or there's genetic gene manipulation. I think that's the common narrative thread that we constantly hear. And again, like, I think part of the thing is like, if you actually if you discuss actual basic cell biology and how it is virtually impossible for the RNA to enter into the nucleus, and and a lot of kind of mechanisms behind it. I think that's one of the many things that just keeps coming back over and over again is a lot of people want to say it is experimental, or that it is gene therapy. And, I've had 4 shots right now. And I can tell you that the last I checked, I'm pretty much the same person as I was several years ago, maybe a few pounds heavier because of pandemic weight, but, it's definitely hasn't changed me. But, I think that's one of the big myths, but, another one being the fact that, vaccines causes miscarriages. This is something that's been more recently ramping up as a narrative. And Dr. Vicky Mayo, who's another, physician who's on a scientist on Twitter, God bless her. She's, constantly fighting the good fight, kind of gathering data and discussing it with people, looking into the data and everything. And really, it's one of those things that, like, even if you were to argue specific cases of people having, cancer or whatever it might be, or whatever very rare side effect, the fact of the matter is if you look at from the large scale epidemiological data, it still does not show evidence of, large scale gene manipulation or cancer or whatever disease like springing up. It just doesn't happen. And, one of the other ones too, I find is like a common thing is like, your immune system will get exhausted if you keep getting these injections and stuff like that. And, I get there is concern about it, but one of the many things I tell people, I'm like, well, this immune exhaustion phenomena happens when there's true viral persistence, really, for the most part. And that doesn't really happen here because, again, we're not introducing the virus from the vaccine. We're introducing a little teeny tiny fragment of the virus that's pertinent for the immune cells to actually recognize that protein. And because of that, it's not necessarily that we're constantly exposing our system to this virus. We're literally just throwing something into our immune system, giving them a blueprint, teaching it for a second, and then it goes away after a while. There's not really much of persistence after that. So that's another one I find is like a common thing. But, it's just, these are just myths that we constantly have to adhere to because I'll say this as very much like for a lot of the anti-vax community is they typically use the same 3-4 stories over and over again. Mm-hmm. But the way they work is that they, throw as much information as possible into kind of the void, and they'll, spread it as quickly as possible. So it's hard to really kind of attack, the sources really, because that information just kind of propagates. So really what I take in really is not necessarily kind of going into that, but really kind of talking with the people who are exposed to it and saying like, okay, well, here's kind of the information framework and why this is not the correct way to think about it. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where I tackle it from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Our account finds that on Twitter. Any kind of somebody with an opinion, a doctor with a rogue opinion about vaccines that gets spread like mm-hmm. wildfire. Like it just gets, I bet you wish some of your tweets get the same kind of tweet retweets that some of the anti-vax doctors or people get. So
I do wish, but at the same time, I think for me, like I tell people, like I always stand by my factors that like, I'm not here to get monetary success or get more publishing or get internet famous. Like if my tweets only get like certain number of likes and it's good information, I still stand by the fact that that's better than, getting a viral tweet and being, like subpar information, which even some of the folks that I know who are pro-vaccines sometimes can inevitably do. And it's something that like, I rather get good quality information and not go viral versus going viral and having subpar information, So that is something that I strive for as much as possible. So
yeah. So my last question, and before we open it up to the floor, this is one that I'm having to explain to my students, right, all the time, is how come the vaccine didn't stop COVID? And I was wondering if you could give, because like there's a good reason why, and there's the scientific reason it makes sense. But when somebody asks you that, how come the first Pfizer vaccines didn't stop COVID? Why do we have to take a vaccine, the bivalent shot, and we'll probably have to take one next year? So I was wondering if you could give me your take on that, because that would help me explain it to my students too, maybe a little bit better.
No, this is a great question. And it's something I always get, because I do have people who come in who do genuinely feel frustrated, understandably so, having to go get another shot. So my general answer to this really is there's several big factors that play into this. And the first one being the fact that there is a true inequity of our vaccine distribution. That's the truth of the matter is. And, I think one of the many things we tend to forget is the United States and Canada and the EU are not the only countries that are there. There's a lot of other countries out there that don't have the access to healthcare framework that we do, that don't have access to technologies or the supply chain network that we have, that really hinders a lot of how we distribute it. When the COVID first really hit, the WHO developed this framework called COVAX, which was supposed to be focusing on, nations donating their extra doses of the vaccines to the lower middle income countries. That was somewhat successful, but not really. And the problem is that, like, again, the more that we let a virus, infect more hosts, you introduce more chances of, mutations happening, and then that selective pressure happening that would eventually create, and I'm being very simplistic in my explanation.
No,
but
this is great. Thank you. Yep.
But that inevitably creates these variants that we know, and there's no, again, I'm not sure. This is not me singling out any countries or whatever, because it can happen anywhere. But the fact of the matter is, even in like the United States, for example, and I'm going to use the United States because that's where I know best, is, if you look at the vaccine distribution, there's a lot of rural counties and rural areas that do not get same access to healthcare that we know, somewhere like in a coastal city, like New York City or Washington, D.C. or San Francisco. And, because of that, like, it makes it very difficult to kind of decide like where, like, okay, how do we ensure that the vaccines are distributed equally? So second factor is really that vaccines prevent infection to a certain point, but the primary purpose always of vaccines, and this is something I always stress that we need to stay on message with, is that vaccines prevent severe disease and death. That is the ultimate goal behind it. So having it kind of stop infection for a certain period of time is a bonus, but our neutralizing antibodies that we generate from that vaccine eventually wanes over time. This is natural. It's supposed to happen this way. But the idea again is that, when we have these newer strains, or not even strains, newer variants that are out there, they're becoming more immune evasive, that are finding newer ways to evade the immunity that we have. It's, more cases are going to pop up as a result of it, and we have to rethink about our strategy. So we're constantly playing this catch-up strategy with, like, vaccine, newer variants, vaccine, newer variants. And there's also a factor, and the final one from a public health standpoint really is we don't take layer mitigation strategies seriously enough. The fact that, when we look at a true pandemic response, it looks at a layered strategy, which is, masking, ensuring that spaces that you're in are well ventilated. All these different things that we're trying to ensure that we maintain. And that's stuff that we kind of always prematurely kind of lift once like things start to look positive, and then wonder why, when a new wave hits, so we're kind of like caught for pants down. And it's something that we're constantly repeating over and over again, with kind of a lot of stuff. But once again, like, it's a bit of the vaccine inequity issue. That's one of the biggest driving factors, I feel. It's also too for the fact that, the vaccines can only do so much, right? We can't hinge all our bets on just vaccines alone. They're a powerful tool, but they can only do so much. And especially when you don't have a community or a population area that's not well vaccinated, those few that are vaccinated inevitably are going to get infected because of the fact that, that it's a higher transmission area. And we're still seeing that with a lot of, the data we're seeing. But, so it's a bit of a combination of a lot of these factors that continue driving this never-ending pandemic, despite what a certain president would like to say. But we're very much still we're kind of in like the calm right now, but we do, like I said, and this is something that we're still monitoring from a global community perspective is, we do see certain variants that have troublesome like mutations / characteristics that could possibly be good candidates to drive the winter wave. And also keeping in mind too, like how we're approaching the pandemic this year versus like the previous years beforehand. Kids are back at school. Yep. Masks are not a thing as much anymore. Ventilation, never heard of it. There's a lot of different factors that we've just kind of like taken for granted, and we're just kind of like, okay, well, it's good to go. We're going to go back to the way things were. And I always argue back and forth again. I was like, we should not be going back to the way things were. We should be improving on what we had beforehand because we have that position to do so. But and our health system really too, and Canada, I know for a fact as well, like the health systems are still recovering. Yeah. Like staffing is still low. Staffing is still very critically low. Staffing is sparse. And, like there's a lot of things that still is what we call the invisible damage that people don't talk about. But these are things that get hit first when a wave hits. And we inevitably go back to this whole, question of like, how did this happen? Where did this come from? And I'm just sitting here waving my hand frantically.
You're like, I have the thing. I told you to watch out for this.
Yeah. Oh. But I think that's kind of a very, very long drawn out answer to your question, really. So,
yeah. So the short of it, it's complicated. Not everybody got vaccinated. That cooked up some variants that spread. The vaccines that people had limited serious death and disease, which was awesome. Everybody's tired, so their guards are down now.
Yep. Yeah. And I know.
Okay. Well, Doc, are you okay taking some questions from the audience?
Love to. Absolutely love to.
Okay, so if you're just tuning in, we have a science communicator and medical science communicator, Dr. Neuro, with us. If you'd like to ask him a question, request the mic. Now, Chris and I are going to be screening the folks who come up. So if we don't know you, or if you've got a locked account, or we check your account and we're like, ooh, I don't know, you may not get up to the stage. So think of a question. Do you think like along the lines of infectious disease, would that be acceptable for questions today, Doc?
Sure. Or if you have questions about the vaccines, or if you're hesitant about the vaccines, I'm happy to take those questions now too.
Perfect. So, yeah. And maybe Final Fantasy 14.
That too, but I will not know much about that now.
Okay. I think actually Chris, are you here, Chris? Or are you gone to go get Marina?
I'm not quite here. I'm still here, yes, but I'm going to be leaving to go get Marina.
Okay.
But there is a question that was in the chat first.
Okay. There's a question in the chat first.
Sure. Yeah, that one.
I have a question. I attend a pain clinic with medications that I have to wait to get a booster shot. Choosing between the medical therapy and vaccine is a struggle. Does a steroid make you immune compromised? That's a good question. That's from Leanne Schaefer.
Yeah, so certain classes of steroids can compromise your immune system, which is why that they do recommend you that you do wait on that. But it is something you should definitely check with folks as well, given especially like this is right now the good window to really consider getting the bivalent vaccine. So if you are concerned about a high transmission risk or risk in your area, talk to your provider to definitely obviously discuss an option to time your vaccine or your steroid administration if it can possibly.
Yeah, I'll tell you, Doc, there's so many kids getting sick right now in school. They're dropping like flies. I think I was down 10.
I know a lot of teachers too. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Okay. So I brought up some speakers. We'll go Sarah, Amanda, Tracy, CC from Twitter, and I will check the other platforms. It doesn't look like we have any speaker requests there. Sarah, go ahead. Do you have a question for the doc?
I do. I have a question and a comment. My comment is you mentioned something earlier about the anti-vax community. Mm-hmm. And it was really big on Twitter, especially when the pandemic started. Even, I'm in the United States, even in the administration then in the United States, there was COVID denial at the highest level, and working against our own CDC, which was something that was unprecedented. We'd never seen that before in this country, and working against the World Health Organization, which was also something very, very unprecedented. For the most part, most of the people who were the loudest voices on Twitter, and I'm talking about people like Jenny McCarthy, like a B celebrity that is very anti-vax. She was always sort of dismissed as a kook for her beliefs. But then the pandemic hits, and rational people were starting to question not only our government's response, but other governments' response, and what was real and what wasn't. And it was, I think that was probably the hardest part. But I think the biggest problem with the misinformation were the legitimate people. And the one that comes to mind is, and I say this, with air quotes, Dr. Drew Pinsky. Y'all know who he is, right? He was like a Gen X icon, and when he started coming out and making these statements about COVID and vaccines, and he wasn't for it, and he still isn't. He does spaces quite frequently, weekly, I believe, and I had the pleasure of being allowed to speak at one where Dr. Drew and we sort of went head to head. Oh. But he was very, very, I will hand it to that gentleman. He was very kind in his disagreement. But my disagreement with him was saying to him, we know that COVID kills. We know, and his argument was it kills the infirm. It kills the elderly, but healthy people, it's a bad flu. And that was his whole premise. And my point to him was every person in this space, his space at the time, can name somebody that had it and is not okay or died. And so I asked him to show me the science. I would love to see the science where healthy people get it and not one healthy person has died. And that's when he had to backtrack. Well, I'm not saying only healthy. So that was a problem with misinformation, is that it was coming from legitimate people that had some sort of legitimacy, maybe not Drew Pinsky, but the other people in the scientific community that were working against what our CDC was saying and what the World Health Organization was saying. And did you find those opinions? How do you think those opinions helped shape the pandemic? Because I'm telling you, and you as a scientist and the two science teachers, this will happen again. A pandemic can happen at any time. There's a virus out there brewing in the Amazon that nobody's ever heard of right now that can get out, or brewing in a laboratory. Who knows? This can happen again. And how do you think the world is going to respond? Better? Worse? Or are we all just so COVID tired that we're going to throw our hands up in the air and say, screw it?
So thank you for your question and your comment. One of the unfortunate aspects of COVID is that it really revealed a lot of sort of systemic issues that CDC was facing, and kind of how fragile our public health response. Because again, this is something that I remind everyone that COVID is the first global pandemic we have ever in our lifetime ever experienced, like a true global pandemic. And one of the problems is that, not having the government will, or having a lot of the, backing of many folks can easily drive a lot of folks who we believe to be, allies or folks who are friends of science to that. But I think one of the many things as well that and it is something that I remind as well, that COVID is really it was a war of attrition really in terms of testing our patience and testing our humanity. And I can tell you right now that we failed. And this is my honest truth, is that we failed as humanity to really address this as a, collective together, because, there were so many things that we could have done better, that we should have addressed, that we had the framework, we had the discussions, but, folks ended up not doing what they were supposed to do. And it continues this drive forward. But I also reiterate the fact that, misinformation and disinformation, a lot of these folks have been working way before COVID has happened. I mean, this has been, brewing since very much the Wakefield paper released when we talked about autisms and the MMR vaccine. But these are things that these are folks that, again, the disinformation, and, I always caveat that misinformation is very much when people inevitably spread bad information, but they don't have the bad intent. But disinformation is where you have folks who spread the bad information willingly to, spread false narratives. And what we ended up seeing was that, you had a very strong collective individuals who were working vigilantly to spread disinformation. Ever since, way before even COVID vaccines were coming out, they were already mobilizing way beforehand. But we also had an administration at that point that was not willing to really address it, because they wanted to score political wins and all sorts of stuff. I will also go on this other, my own point as well. And I say this as well as a, private citizen, and also someone who's worked in the federal space for a very long time. The CDC has not done the greatest of jobs in many of the communications at the beginning. We were not consistent. We were not clear. We did not do things that we were supposed to really inform the public. And it caused a lot of confusion. And what ended up happening from that confusion, you ended up brewing a lot of misinformation and empowering disinformation folks. And so we're doing a little bit better, but I can tell you right now, from my own personal stance, we can do a lot more. But there's a lot that we're seeing here that is limiting ourselves as, a agency, but also kind of in terms of a worldwide response, that we simply just, if another pandemic happens again, my honest opinion is that we probably will end up repeating the same mistakes over and over again, because maybe not to the drastic effect of the COVID at the beginning, maybe, but I can tell you right now, there's a lot of things that I'm seeing pattern-wise in a lot of local governments and a lot of state governments, not even here, but in other countries as well, where, we're kind of just wait and see, and, rather than getting ahead of the curve and investing in things such as, genomic surveillance, or investing in things such as, a global cohort to ensure that we get life-saving therapies and vaccines to the most needy people. There are a lot of things that we should be doing that we really haven't done, and we haven't done well, at least. And so if you ask me, in all honesty, that if we're prepared, I would say maybe 15% we're probably prepared, but we've got a long ways to go before we're even at the preparedness stage that I feel comfortable in. So
I can tell you our science tweets, Doc, had so much more reach than Health Canada. on Twitter. And that's a problem when science dogs are telling Canada what they should think about vaccines. I mean, we did our best. But like that was a big failure by government bodies to clearly explain it like 24 hours a day in a way that engaged the public.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But I'm glad you're here talking to us, right? Like, I mean, that's a step forward.
Absolutely.
Sarah, that was an awesome question. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for your question.
Happy belated birthday.
Oh, it's
Thank you.
It's your birthday, Doc? A couple days ago?
No, it was a couple days ago.
Oh,
a couple days ago. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. I'm so sorry. I have been so busy. Normally I do better background.
Oh, no, you're... Thank you. I turned 21. I'm teasing. I wish.
Are you Doogie Howser?
I was going to say.
They're filming the sequel with
Neil
me.
Patrick Harris. Okay. Over to Amanda. Hi, Amanda. Thank you for coming.
Hey, Dr. Neuro. Hey, Jason. Hey, Chris.
Hello.
So I'm going to lob you a soft one here, and it segues nicely with the last question. What can each of us do to counter misinformation or disinformation? Because this is a big problem.
You know, Amanda, and I'm glad that you're up here too. I know we shared several spaces, and I'm glad that you're here as well. A wonderful voice for long COVID folks as well. But I think one of the many things you can do really is be better stewards of spreading good information. And I think one of the many things I tell people is like, if you're truly here to champion good information, and one is scrutinize every information, even if it's coming from a person that you feel is a reputable position. You should always do that. I always encourage people in my own, Twitter following and Twitch. I'm like, fact check me constantly. If I say something wrong, fact check me, because that's the responsibility of everyone. That we should be much more cognizant about how we communicate and ask questions. Second is really when you do see something that really clicks with you, if it really makes sense, and if it is good information, spread it. If you see something like, it doesn't even have to be my thread. If I find something that someone else did a wonderful explanation, like one of my good friends, Edward Nierenberg, who, does wonderful posts about very complicated cellular mechanisms of like viruses and stuff like that. I always look at it and I'm like, hey, this is good information. I'm going to retweet it and make sure people read this. And, one of those things, if you truly do feel like it's good information, try to do your best to spread it. And third really is, and this is something that's a very hard tactic to learn from everyone, is understanding the good to bad faith actors that are out there in the world. Because, one of the many things I tell people is like, if someone truly comes up to me and is truly anti-vax, stalwart anti-vax, is not willing to acknowledge the science and is not willing to acknowledge the work that's behind it, I'm not going to waste my energy doing that. But my energy is going to be better utilized in this case for someone who's truly hesitant. And there could be people who are really hesitant, right? There's a difference between those who are extremely vaccine hesitant versus a true anti-vaxxer. And I always distinguish that. And being able to distinguish that really helps you being able to gauge like, where do your energy best utilized on to have these discussions on it. Changing one person's mind can make a drastic difference. You have no idea in terms of like, and I tell people this kind of goes back to my original point. Like, I rather have a non-viral tweet that's really good, that has good information, and maybe 30 people like it or retweet it. I'd rather that be the case, because then I know that those 30 people will share that information out with their following, and then their following will share that. And it makes a ripple effect for that. It might not make as impactful as those anti-vaxxers, but we also have to remember that anti-vaxxers are very well mobilized. They have resources that there are a lot of resources pumped into them to ensure that a lot of this information gets out. But it's a war of attrition, really, when it comes to misinformation, disinformation. It exhausts us constantly to do this. And the final thing really is just be kinder to yourself, to everyone. Like, I tell everyone, like, take a break once in a while. Like, if you haven't noticed, like, my tweets are kind of all over the place sometimes. Like, Sundays, I am so exhausted from work. I just want to post pictures of my cats and say, look how silly Bucket looks, or, whatever it might be. But I have to remind people that I'm a human too, and being kinder to yourself is a reflection to people that, again, none of us are infallible. We're human beings, and we make mistakes, and we need loving too. So I think those are kind of like different tips as well for if you really want to kind of look into combating misinformation.
That's a great question, Amanda. Thank you for being part of this space tonight. Okay, we'll go over to Tracy, then Cece. Hi, Tracy. How are you doing tonight?
Hi, I'm doing well. How are you guys doing?
We're good.
Wonderful.
So I may have missed this in the beginning because I was actually a couple minutes late. So your Twitter name is Dr. Neuro, but you work in infectious diseases. So how did you make that switch? Or were you never, did you just like neurology or?
So my PhD is also in computational neuroscience. So the brain and actually neuroinfectious diseases in general are like one of my biggest passions. But I was very much, I think the reason why also is that, and this is a name that I created way beforehand, which kind of stuck with me. But I was discussing this at the beginning. But the reason why I got into kind of the field that I'm in was that I had a wonderful AP psychology teacher who taught me about neuroscience and how nerves communicate with each other. And I was just like, oh my God, neurons are so cool. So I kind of really stuck with that name.
That's cool. My other quick thing is, do you have a pet story?
I do.
Thanks, Tracy.
I'd love that question. I have two cats. One is an older tortie named Mako, and I have a younger boy named Bucket. He's an orange tabby. But my favorite story to tell, because Bucket usually gets a lot of limelight because he's just a very photogenic cat, is my older tortie. She was at the shelter, and when I went to go look for a cat for my birthday, I remember this. I searched high and low for a cat, through the shelter, and I'm very much in the belief that a cat chooses you. So I, went back and forth, and I was just like, which cat really drives me? Which one is it going to be? And I see in the corner of my eye, after several hours, this one lonely cat who had a sign above her head that said, I have been rated as the friendliest cat in the shelter, and I've been in the shelter for 8 months.
Oh.
And it broke my heart. Oh. And I went over to her, and she yelled it was like the sweet, oh my God, you're here, I love you. And she reached her paw at me, and she was she was 4 years old, so it was very much like an adult tortoiseshell cat. And the area it's just like darker cats typically, and most people notice it's they typically don't get adopted. And I fell in love with her, and I brought her home. But she has been, a lot of people say, does she have a tortitude? And she definitely does not. She's one of the friendliest cats ever. And I think everyone I've ever brought home, to meet, she's always been such a friendly spirit. And, I tell people, I'm like, it takes one good cat to really change your perspective. You're not really much against if you're against cats. I was like, it takes one good cat to really change your perspective on them. And I love both animals, all animals really. So.
That is a sweet story. I wasn't there. Chris, can you talk? Are you driving? I don't know if you're driving, but
I'm not driving yet.
You're not driving yet, but no. Wasn't that with you and Adam with Ginger? Didn't Ginger kind of pick you guys? She just had this instant connection with you?
100%. We were not leaving without that cat. Well, we had to leave for 24 hours because they make you wait. So it's not an impulse, but I said, Adam, come hell or high water, we're getting that cat. And I can usually leave with them, but she talked to our hearts, and we had to have her.
Love it. Yeah. I love it.
And I'm not a cat person, and this cat, oh my God, she is this little sweet thing.
I love it.
Okay, sorry, I lost track. Over to Cece. Cece, thanks for waiting.
Yeah, of course. Can everybody hear me okay? I have headphones on today.
We're good, yes. Cece.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for this really fascinating space. And also thanks so much for sharing how to find credible information. I'm a librarian and for college students. And so these are a lot of the same things that we cover in a general sense. So it's great to hear them getting shared in a more public space too. So my question is actually, and I'm sorry, I had a little bit of internet troubles at the beginning. So if you covered this already, like, sorry. But how do you determine what is the appropriate size for a clinical trial? Like, how do you determine how many people? Because obviously you would want like a big set, but how do you determine sort of like what's possible and what's the ideal?
I mean, like the more the better, but also like it also depends really on the logistics of the people who are managing, someone like such as Pfizer, Merck, or, whatever they might be. They can easily manage a larger clinical trial that might be, but a much smaller, like maybe academic institute or pharmaceutical industry might not be able to manage a larger study like this. But it's also much about like, ensuring that you have a sample size, and I could get into a little bit of stats on that one, but really ensuring that you find a sample size large enough that you can truly randomize a general population from all different types of age groups, all different types of like, conditions or exposures or whatever they might be, and being able to split them across evenly, so that you can do a actual head-to-head comparison between the two. And so that's kind of what the primary thing is. Like, obviously, like something such as small as like 31 people probably would not do, or even like, for example, Wakefield was like less than 10 people.
seven people at a kid's birthday party or something. Like
something absurd.
It was ridiculous.
But that's not even a clinical trial, It was like, like I think, again, like when you look at something like, Pfizer's like initial trial, like employ like several thousands of people globally, right? And, from all different walks of life, all different types of exposures, those who got COVID, those who didn't, those who are in high risk environment, those aren't, those who are elderly, who are young. And you want to get that variety to really ensure that you get the full picture and control, really control, get those variables like, those weird variables out of the way. So that way you get that comprehensive picture. So there's no real like, quote unquote, like magical number per se, because it can also vary sometimes on the intervention you're trying to investigate. Like, for example, Alzheimer's, like you're not going to get thousands of people on Alzheimer's drug. Like that's a very difficult task, because if we had that many people like instantly get Alzheimer's, that would be very problematic. But I think it's one of those things that you have to look at the prevalence and the reality of the disease that you're trying to really tackle. Something such as like another one I think of is like, a lot of those clinical trials for cancer drugs, for example. You're not going to get as many people on that as you would like to, just because it's, again, like you don't have like tons of people who are just suddenly going to get these rare, prostate cancer or whatever it might be. So it depends on, again, like what intervention and what, disease you're really trying to tackle. So there's no real magical number really, but, again, something such as like with the vaccines, for example, like for something such as COVID, which was so widespread, that does definitely, like I said, I think should deserve like a large number of people to investigate. But I will caveat too, one of the many things that's challenging with the newer trials, especially with the bivalent vaccine, is that it's going to get harder and harder for us to recruit people into these clinical trials, because you have different people with different levels of exposure or different levels of vaccinations all over the world, that it makes for a very complicated like study, because you have people who have had a primary series but never got boosted, people who got primary series and boosted, people who been exposed to the virus but never been vaccinated, people who have been primary series and then infected but not boosted. Like the permutations are very wide, and it makes it very difficult to do like subsequent clinical trials to do that. So I always tell people, like, you're not going to expect that same level of, magnitude that you saw at the first trial, but it's still significant in many ways. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And that's really fascinating. I hadn't thought that it would get trickier as it goes on with all of the boosters, but that makes so much sense. Thanks so much, Dr. Neuro.
Of course.
All right. I think we are all done with I think we're all done with speakers. I'm looking across the different social media channels that we are beaming the signal out to. Yeah, just give me a second here.
Of course.
Yeah. I have one more question for you, Doc.
Of course.
Okay, so I'm assuming you've seen the TV show, like the infection TV show, like Outbreak, and the and the newest one. Oh, what's it called? With it's got Lawrence Fishburne in it. It's not called Outbreak. You know the one I'm talking about? Dang it. What the heck?
I don't. I'm actually going to be honest. I can't watch those shows because I get so irrationally mad.
Okay. See, so that was going to be my question, right? Oh, Contagion. That's what I'm trying to think of. Is that, do you like, you can't watch those shows because you're watching it and you're like, that is just the worst.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or it's just, I mean, like and I understand, like a lot of these shows have to go for, you can't just sit there and have people be like, let's sit here and have a policy meeting. That's not going to be, doesn't make for very sexy TV, but I understand why they have to do it the way. But, I'll just sit there and sometimes I'm just like, wow, that is terrible, like, management right there, like infection management protocol right there. And that's like, what are they doing for decontamination? Oh my God, why are they setting up the tent nearby those people? Like, there's so many things.
It's too close.
And just like, I get like so irate over, but I think some of these are like some of the ones that like are based off of like, I think there's one that was based off of the Reston Ebola outbreak, or a real Ebola case that happened. And
yeah, that was Outbreak. Outbreak was
Outbreak. Yeah.
Yeah. Contagion was, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no. I think I can't remember too much of it, but I think that one was probably the quote unquote most accurate, but they definitely like dramatize a lot of the different portions of it too. So I can't be like, too angry about it.
Yeah. What struck me the strangest in the movie Contagion, it's like a respiratory virus that people get with a fairly high fatality rate. Is there's not people that don't want the vaccine in the end, right? Like everybody wants it because, and I was like, wait a second, they need to have like a contingent of people that don't want the vaccine.
I would, if an actual like episode came out of those shows where it's just like, now we tackle with the anti-vax communities. I'm like, okay, now we have I want to see how they do this. I'll watch it. But I always kind of like roll my eyes a little bit when they're like, we have a vaccine treatment now. Things are fine. Credits roll. And you're like, no, there's a lot more challenge after that.
Anyways, yeah. But one of the things that was cool in Contagion, you haven't seen it, is it did show like the cross-species contamination of how the virus got to humans, which is, perhaps how that happened with COVID. Do you have time for a couple more speakers, Doc, or do you got to get going? Okay. So we'll go to Sarah, your hand's up, and then Stephanie. Sarah, did you have something quick here or another question?
I was trying to tell you Contagion. And you know what? I was going to mention that because Contagion, there was an anti-vaxxer in there, and it was the Jude Law character.
Oh, right.
Remember?
He had Forsyth or Forsyth or something. Cynthia is like a herbal thing. Everybody was going mental trying to get. You're right. Yes.
But I thought that movie was prescient. When the country shut down, our state, I'm in Washington State, nobody come stalk me. But my state was the first state that had COVID, and we were the first state to shut down.
King County, I remember, yeah. Yeah,
King County. It hit the nursing homes, and it was just going like wildfire. And it's like we have Comcast here, and it's like Comcast listened because they started showing all these like Outbreak and Contagion. So my husband and I, we spent the first weekend of lockdown, which was my birthday in March 11th. We watched these movies back to back, and we sort of guffawed at it. Like, this is only going to be 2 weeks. Like, we're going to be down for 2 weeks. And, everybody's complaining and crying about nothing. And we were walking around without masks. We were like, big deal. It's the flu, you whiners. And that was sort of like, because we were exposed to the Hollywood version of what this could be like. But contagion was actually, Jason, if you remember, it was a little prescient. The world shut down. It wasn't much like it did. People were afraid. And then there was this whole group of anti-vaxxers that came saying, you're all whiners, you're all complaining over nothing. But when we watched it, we sort of chuckled at it. But then later, when we got to thinking and we watched it again, it sort of became a Hollywood version of a blueprint. And I found it to be absolutely terrifying because honestly, and doctor, shut me down if I'm wrong, but something like that could happen. Look at Spanish flu. Spanish flu was novel and it killed a third of the world. And something like that could happen, a contagion level event, we could call it, where it does infect more people. And maybe it's, maybe you don't have as good a chances to live if you're a healthy person. And I think that COVID should have been the wake-up call that the world needed, but it wasn't. People got tired. Even I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I totally support the scientific community, but I got tired. I got tired of it after, 6 months where I couldn't do the things that I wanted to do. And then when Christmas rolled around, I couldn't have my children home because they were all over the country. And I was just finished. And that is what people will remember, when the tales are told. Remember COVID in 2019, 2020? And people will be like, oh, yeah, it was no big deal. But we can't get lax. And our country in the United States and in Canada and other countries, we need to have a reminder of how bad it could get and not become complacent again, because we all thought it was a joke. Do you remember when the CDC, sorry, Jason, I'm going off on a tangent, but do you remember when the CDC on their website, I work in the healthcare community and we had the biggest joke about it. They had a pandemic preparedness, but they used zombies because it was sort of at the height of The Walking Dead. And it was actually a pretty slick campaign. They did it like, if a zombie apocalypse comes, what will you do? This is what you'll do. It turns out that all that information was completely wrong. Have trash bags, have water, have $100 in cash.
You needed toilet paper, Sarah.
We need it, God.
That's what the CDC should have told people.
I'm angry that I did not invest in Charmin. I'd be a billionaire right now. But the things that they said that we needed in a pandemic, it was almost laughable. I think I have a copy of that saved on my computer. If I do, I'll DM it to you because they removed it pretty quickly when the pandemic hit. But it was actually, nobody was prepared, not even our own government. And that's what makes it sad, because now we know people are going to panic buy certain things. At Costco, for example, in my area, you couldn't find the 50-pound bags of flour. Who was buying 50-pound bags of flour?
People were making a lot of bread, Sarah.
Well, I bought a bread maker because he couldn't find bread. And apparently I am not Martha Stewart, by the way. I made something that looked like bread, but was complete dough in the middle. Yeah. But we weren't prepared. And I hope before the next one hits, hopefully not in my lifetime, but that we are better prepared, because nobody was prepared for the long haul, for sitting at home and, the loneliness that came with it, especially people that were alone and truly felt alone. And by the way, a pet thing, Jason, in the United States, people were adopting pets out of shelters at an astronomical rate, probably in Canada too.
Yeah, they was similar in Canada. Yes.
And now they're returning them.
Yeah, it's pretty heartbreaking for sure.
And so we're on a list now to foster some of these dogs, because so many people return them, which, that's a whole nother, we should do a pet chat on that.
That's a whole nother space. Yeah.
Yeah.
But over to the doc, like, was Sarah's kind of story / testimony resonating with you?
No. So several things, like, thank you again. Like, I think, first thing you highlighted, I really want to always elucidate is that there was a lot of mental toll that took with like something like a pandemic, right? We've never had something of a situation that prevented families from having to get together. And, here's the thing is that I 100%, 110% will empathize and will not, disacknowledge the fact that people are tired. People are, very sad about, a lot of the different situations that had to come across that they had to sacrifice during the pandemic. And so there was definitely a mental toll that many took. And, the second also being the fact that, like, whether if like something will happen down the line. So this is like a paper, actually, and one day I will share the paper. But like I wrote was, we're going to be seeing more outbreaks and more, zoonotic spillovers happen within our lifetime.
I'm sorry, what spillovers, doctor? What spillovers?
Zoonotic spillovers. So in this case right here, from an animal to a human, like reservoir for a virus can jump to a human. So we're going to be seeing much more of these situations possibly happen because of climate change. It's causing humans having to migrate more towards areas where animals will reside. We're going to see much more situations where we have conflicts and mass migration events that happen. And also keeping in mind too that after COVID, people are much more in tuned and a lot more eyes are on the fact that, if something does happen, right? And I can't tell you the amount of DMs I get from people who say like, oh my God, this is happening in this country right now. I'm like, well, this country's actually been dealing with this type of disease for quite some time. And they actually have a process for it. And so like the amount of times I have folks who talk to me about Ebola, for example, one of the many things I say that it's very unfortunate that the news cycle doesn't talk about it is that Uganda actually reached out to the international community asking for help, which most people are like, well, that's what they're supposed to do. But I can tell you right now that that's very unprecedented, that the African countries are actually very well structured and very well organized for Ebola crisis response because they've been dealing with that crap for a long time and they have a system. And the fact that they actually reached out, and I think recent data show that it's the 12th largest Ebola outbreak within the past few days. Like, these are situations that are inevitably going to happen. And I don't want to like sugarcoat it and tell you that there's no more diseases that's ever going to happen. That's me lying to you. And I don't know really what's going to happen down the line if a contagion of COVID level will happen again, how we will respond. But I can tell you right now, at least from my stance personally, that from a preparedness perspective, we should be doing a lot more that we're not doing. But I also, again, like, things such as polio coming over to the United States. There's even like certain vaccinations like polio, routine polio vaccinations, where people are not vaccinating as much on a lot of these, or people don't know about this stuff. And, I encourage everyone really, like, one of the many things I always do in my own personal Twitch stream, I pull up that vaccination schedule, the immunization schedule. And I'm like, okay, people, are you up to date on your Are you up to date on your DTaP? Are you up to date on your, MMR vaccine? Are you like all these things I'm asking, because these are things that, again, like I think one of the things I always mention to people is that having access to healthcare, unfortunately in the United States is like a privilege, and it's unfortunate. And it makes me so irate to hear when people say like, I can't go to a doctor because I can't afford to. And that's the accessibility part and equity in my coming out, because I get so irate because imagine if everyone had access to healthcare without having to worry about the price tag, how much we could address so many of these health crisis situations. I can tell you right now that it would certainly put a huge dent in many aspects, and not just the United States, but worldwide. But we don't have that. And that's part of the reason why, like, again, like, I think we could be doing so much more, but there's so many systemic issues that, people are like talking about now. I'm like, these are problems that existed way before COVID. People before COVID times were worried about going to the emergency room because they were worried about the cost of an ambulance, and I'm like, that should never happen. We should not be worried as, citizens of a developed nation to think about costs like that. But here we are. And I could get on a cold grandstand on this one, but
that's a whole nother space.
And these are situations I always like constantly like champion as well. And it's the reason why, again, like, getting back to these, these prescient movies and stuff like that. It's like, there is kind of an impact statement to it. And, I encourage everyone really. Another thing that people can be doing is put pressure and accountability on your local politician and your state government as well to do better about championing like these like healthcare costs, or healthcare reasons, like, even something as simple, not simple, but like something as impactful as women's health access, right? Especially with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, like that has like so many repercussions beyond just abortion that can easily like increase the mortality rate. And I can't imagine like how many people were afraid when that was overturned, that people were just starting to fear like that type of stuff. And we should not be fearing that. And I don't know, I could get on the whole tangent on that one, which I won't. But yeah, so that's kind of where I stand in a lot of this.
Well, the one thing I'll add before we go to Stephanie, because Stephanie's been waiting, is I think like myself personally, we have to testify to the people who did not come out of this pandemic at all, or they came out of it with long COVID. It wasn't binary. It wasn't like you either got it and you were fine or you died. There's a whole schwack of people that are going to be living the rest of their life with some kind of long COVID symptoms. And as Sarah said, like there's going to be people that will say, a lot of people are going to say, oh, it was nothing. I was just, we watched Netflix for 2 years and it was fine. And that is not the case for a lot of people. So we just have to testify to that as we age, tell our kids and they'll tell our kids.
Yes.
Sarah, thanks for your comments again. Thanks for the great answer, Doc. Last speaker today is Stephanie. Stephanie, hi. Thanks for waiting.
Hey, thanks for having me. How you doing?
Good.
Hey, Dr. Neuro.
Hi, friend.
Hi. I'm sitting here punching emojis on Twitter.
I see it.
Because I don't know. I am tired. I am frustrated. And I will also tell you, I've been reaching out to a lot of journalists and news outlets to say, I really want someone to jump headfirst into, a 10-part series that's not just writing, but also video interviews about what went wrong and looking back as to the things we did not have in place, what needs to be in place. We are in a global economy, global travel, low vaccination rates for kids, a strong anti-vaccine movement, social media platforms that have us all survive based on our likes and interests in silos of information that are starting to frame our realities. Once upon a time, we all could agree, that grass is green and that sky is blue. And we aren't even agreeing on that anymore. And I think we have a monumental effort amongst us to come together as a global citizenry and say, social media platforms are fantastic. We're connecting with expertise and people we otherwise would not be able to. We also have to understand that we have got to create some level of accountability. And again, I know this, this analogy is offered with a high level of frequency, but for lack of a better one at this moment, we made a decision that you can't scream fire in a crowded building. Why? Because of the consequences, meaning if there wasn't a fire, of course. And we're going to have to figure out how to translate this from a digital perspective. What disinformation does, the radicalization of Americans that is happening, and that's not a partisan statement, that's just a fact. And because of where we are now as a society, this was a complete, and pardon my français, but this was a complete shit show. We had, institutions, elected officials who were nowhere near prepared to deal with the messaging around this. Nobody, unless you're in science, really understands the scientific method. So when Dr. Fauci came out and said, don't worry, you don't need masks, he probably was thinking about the fact that, oh my God, we need our healthcare professionals actually to be covered when they're dealing with COVID patients. We don't have enough supply. So, from the beginning, not to mention, I'm sorry for those of you in the audience that number 45, we had a president with stakeholders within his administration that were hell-bent on spreading actively disinformation. And so what's interesting, Dr. Neuro, is, I know you've been talking a lot. I've been reflecting on this. We are going to have another pandemic, and I'm not sure it's going to be another sort of 100-year because of a global economy, global travel. And if we don't have the smart kids in the back of the classroom get together on both sides of the aisle, on all sides of the aisle, and understand that the impacts of an entire planet getting sick, and depending on whether you're a person of color, your access to healthcare, it shuts down an economy. It shuts down your supply chain. The impacts of ignoring or spreading disinformation around this, can we really afford to do this again? Now, I'm not going to argue what policy decisions were made, what weren't made, was it the right thing to do, was it the wrong thing to do? I'm not going to argue that tonight. But if we do not get our shit together, the impacts on human lives, the economy, jobs, supply chain, food, we cannot do this again. And I'm hoping that we see all sides of the aisle come together and say, we can't afford this again. So we're all going to have to get on the side of facts and science. Otherwise, we're going to do this again. And I will land my plane there.
Always well spoken. Thank you, Steph.
Thanks, Stephanie.
I kind of love Stephanie, just saying.
Me too. I'm a huge fan. I will, my last parting thoughts really, and I know I'm dragging this poor space out even longer.
No, it's all good. This is important, right? And plus too, as like again, I keep mentioning it, I'm Canadian, so like some of this stuff is not something that I know anything about, right? So, or a boot. I think one of the a boot. I think one of the many things too, I want to leave this on a less, unfortunately, very stark images. I want to share this one story of a long COVID survivor that still sticks with me to this day. Was I had a friend who had this bright 16-year-old kid who, we've been friends for a very long time. I watched this kid grow from kindergarten to bright high schooler and straight A kid. Was going to really go to their dream college and everything, and caught COVID during the beginning of the pandemic. And this kid, after they recovered, had mild symptoms, by the way. As people would like to say, mild symptoms. Came out of there, and for weeks on end, would come home every day crying because they could not remember the lessons they learned every day from that class. They kept, and even though that they were present, taking notes and doing everything they can, they would come home and just be like, I don't understand stoichiometry. I don't understand this. I don't understand any of this. They were not able to be able to process cognitively. They were just not there to process it. And to this day, they're still there. They got the special accommodation for it, but eventually, that individual had suicidal ideation and all these other factors because they were just that depressed. And from this, and I tell people, there are so many things that we don't think about. It's not about just death. It's about the long-term implications and long-term factors that when we look at these diseases like this, that we're still discovering long-term sequelae of the diseases that we must be cognizant of, and we must be always, making sure that we're doing our best to not catch it. We're doing there are people who legit get proud of the fact that I caught COVID 5 times and I'm still fine. And I'm like, I am so happy for you. Really, I am. But please don't test the waters constantly. For me, I caught COVID earlier this year, despite my best efforts. I can tell you right now, I am not going to try to I'm going to still do my best to not catch it. I'm still doing everything I can to not, I'm assessing my risk and doing my best, but I know not everyone is. And at some point, I know people are tired. And I share the story many times because I tell people that, disease impacts goes beyond just being in a hospital or dying from it. It can impact your livelihood. It can impact your loved ones in ways that you can't imagine. And when we look at diseases from that perspective, when we bring the humanity back into it, I think then we can start to have that discussion. But there's so many things that we're kind of neglecting, and we kind of
pushed to the wayside because it's a political win or it's an economic win. And I'm like, there are people behind these numbers. There are people behind every single statistics we state. And we must remember that every time. And we must be sure that empathy is never lost in a response, or as a healthcare provider, or as a librarian, as a teacher. We must remember that people are still trying to do their best to live. And we must respect that. And we must do our best to ensure that people are reducing their risk as much as possible. So that's what I kind of want to leave it with at the end.
I've heard this before, that if we can just think about we and not about me, then so many of the issues in our society would start to fade away.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. Wow, powerful space. Dr. Neuro, thank you for being our guest tonight. I really appreciate you coming to talk to us. You're welcome back anytime to just continue this discussion. I think we could just keep going and picking at this for hours, but I'll respect your time and everybody else that's listening to kind of wrap up the space, if that's okay.
Absolutely. And thank you again for having me. And I did warn you, I talk a lot. So.
No, it's perfect. No,
but yes, thank you again for the lovely questions, by the way, for everyone. This was a very lovely space.
Yeah. It was very, all the questions were so well thought, for sure. So just as we wrap up, just for my podcast, Dr. Neuro, thank you for being our guest tonight. Everybody in the space who's listening, make sure you follow the doc, follow Dr. Neuro. Just click on the profile there. Check out Twitch. He might be playing some Minecraft. I don't know. No, probably talking about misinformation and educating you about vaccines. To all of our speakers who came up to ask great questions, thank you so much. Now, I was having trouble putting it in the space, but our partner in